Tonight, one of this century's most ambitious projects at the largest reservoir in the nation, which looked like this in 2000. Take a look at what it looks like now. It was so low it could become useless to communities that rely on it. Instead of looking to the sky, engineers are looking miles beneath the surface to get water by essentially pulling the plug of the nation's biggest bathtub.
There is a lake in the Nevada desert that used to be full to the brim, and today it isn't even close. Anyone who has flown into Las Vegas and glanced out the window has probably seen it. A vast blue-green basin ringed by a strange band of white rock, like a bathtub that someone forgot to drain properly. That white band is the story of an entire region's water crisis written directly onto stone. And beneath the surface of that same lake, engineers have spent the last 2 decades building one of the strangest and most expensive insurance policies in American history. The lake is Lake Mead, the reservoir created when Hoover Dam was finished in the 1930s, and it is the single largest reservoir by capacity in the United States. For most of the 20th century, it was treated as a kind of permanent guarantee, an enormous bank of water sitting behind a concrete wall that would always be there when cities and farms needed it. That assumption has been quietly falling apart for 25 years, and nowhere has the response been more dramatic than in Las Vegas, a city that decided not to wait around and find out what would happen if the lake kept shrinking. To understand why a city would spend $1.5 billion tunneling through rock beneath an active reservoir, you first have to understand how Hoover Dam and Lake Mead came to exist in the first place, and why the entire system was built on a number that was wrong from the very start. Hoover Dam rose out of the Black Canyon of the Colorado River during the depths of the Great Depression, at a moment when the country badly needed both jobs and a symbol that it could still accomplish something enormous. Thousands of workers labored in brutal desert heat to pour millions of cubic yards of concrete, and when it was finished in 1936, it stood as the tallest dam on Earth and the largest concrete structure ever built by human hands. Behind it, the Colorado River backed up for more than 100 miles into the desert, forming Lake Mead. The dam's turbines turned falling water into electricity for millions of homes across 3 states, and the reservoir behind it became the water supply that allowed Las Vegas, Phoenix, and a good portion of Southern California to grow into major cities in a place that otherwise could barely support a small town. But the entire arrangement rested on a legal document signed years before the dam was even finished, and that document contained a mistake baked directly into its foundation. In 1922, representatives from 7 states met in New Mexico and divided the Colorado River's water among themselves, promising a combined 16.5 million acre-feet a year to the upper and lower basin states, with an additional allotment later granted to Mexico. The trouble was that the negotiators had based their calculations on river flow measurements taken during an unusually wet stretch of years in the early 20th century. When scientists later reconstructed centuries of the river's actual flow using tree-ring data, the long-term average turned out to be significantly lower than what had been promised on paper. In other words, the 7 states had divided up more water than the river reliably produces, and for decades the shortfall was quietly absorbed by draining stored water out of Lake Mead itself. That is the mechanism behind everything that has happened since. Every year the river delivers less than the paper promises. The difference comes out of the reservoir, and the reservoir has been paying that bill for a very long time. In the year 2000, Lake Mead sat near its historic high point. Since then, it has fallen by more than 100 feet, a decline scientists studying tree rings and drought records now describe as part of the most severe dry period the American Southwest has experienced in over 1,000 years. The lake dropped below key benchmarks one after another through the 2000s and 2010s, eventually triggering the federal government's first formal shortage declaration in 2021 and forcing mandatory cuts on Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. In 2022, the lake fell to its lowest level since it was first filled in the 1930s, low enough that sunken boats, decades-old debris, and even human remains that had been hidden underwater for generations began to resurface along the exposed shoreline. Beneath the shortage tiers that grab headlines, there are deeper thresholds that matter even more. If a lake keeps falling, it eventually reaches a point called minimum power pool, where the water sits too low to reach Hoover Dam's turbine intakes at all, and electricity generation stops completely. Below that sits an even more severe threshold known as dead pool, the point at which the lake can no longer release water past the dam by gravity at all. At dead pool, nothing flows downstream. Arizona, California, Mexico, and every farm and city relying on water released from the far side of Hoover Dam would simply stop receiving it. It sounds almost theoretical when you first hear about it, but the lake has already covered roughly half the remaining distance to that threshold since the year 2000, and the trend has not reversed. This is the backdrop against which Las Vegas made an unusual decision roughly 20 years ago. Rather than waiting for interstate negotiations to solve the underlying shortage, or hoping for a string of unusually wet winters to refill the reservoir, the Southern Nevada Water Authority looked at the trajectory of the lake and concluded that the city's existing water intakes were built for a lake that no longer existed. The original intake pipes had been installed decades earlier, engineered to draw water from a lake mead that was expected to stay relatively full. As the lake fell through the 2000s, those pipes edged closer and closer to the surface, and officials realized that if the decline continued, the intakes would eventually be left drawing air instead of water. The solution the water authority settled on was almost audacious in its ambition. Drill an entirely new intake far below the existing ones, straight through solid rock beneath the floor of an active reservoir. In 2008, construction crews began boring a tunnel roughly 3 miles long, working hundreds of feet beneath the lakebed, drilling through hard rock one stretch and waterlogged, fault-riddled ground the next, with nothing but rock and hundreds of feet of water sitting above their heads the entire time. It was, by any measure, one of the more dangerous and technically demanding tunneling projects undertaken anywhere in the world that decade, and it went on to win engineering awards from professional organizations across multiple countries. By the time the tunnel was finished, workers had poured more than 1,000 truckloads of concrete to anchor a new intake structure, weighing over 1,000 tons, directly to the bottom of the reservoir. That new intake, generally referred to as the third intake, began operating in 2015, reaching water at a depth far below the original 2 pipes. But there was a catch. The new intake initially still relied on shared pumping infrastructure with the older system, which meant it could only function once the lake stayed above a certain level. So the Water Authority went a step further and built a dedicated low lake level pumping station specifically designed to push water even when the reservoir kept falling. That pumping station came online in 2022, at almost the exact moment one of the city's original pumping stations became unusable because the lake had dropped too far beneath it. Together, the third intake and its dedicated pumping station can now draw water from depths of roughly 875 feet above sea level, which sits below the dead pool threshold of Hoover Dam itself. In practical terms, that means if the Colorado River system ever reaches the point where Hoover Dam physically cannot release another drop downstream, and every other state and country relying on that release is cut off entirely, Las Vegas would still be able to pull water out of whatever remains in the lake. The total cost of building that capability came to roughly $1.5 billion, financed largely through local water rates rather than federal funding, making it one of the largest self-funded municipal infrastructure projects of its kind in the country. It would be easy to look at a project like this and conclude that Las Vegas is drinking more than its fair share of a shrinking resource, but the numbers actually complicate that story. Southern Nevada's entire annual allocation from the Colorado River is a small fraction of what either Arizona or California receives, and agriculture across the wider region consumes the overwhelming majority of the water taken from the river each year. On top of that, Las Vegas has become one of the more water-efficient large cities in North America, aggressively paying residents to remove ornamental grass, recycling nearly all of its indoor water back into the lake, and banking additional water underground in local aquifers for use during especially dry years. Between the early 2000s and the mid-2020s, the region added hundreds of thousands of new residents while actually reducing its total water consumption, an outcome that stands in sharp contrast to the assumption that a desert city built around casinos and fountains must be an obvious water hog. None of that changes the underlying math of the river, however. Even the most sophisticated engineering cannot manufacture water that simply isn't falling from the sky in the Rocky Mountains. In the winter of 2025 into 2026, snowpack in the mountains that feed the Colorado River came in at historic lows, and an early spring heat wave burned off much of what little snow there was before it could properly melt and run downstream. Federal water managers, forced to choose between protecting hydropower generation at Lake Powell upstream or maintaining flows into Lake Mead, opted to hold water back at Powell, a decision that accelerated Lake Mead's decline and raised the real possibility of a sharp additional cut to Hoover Dam's power output. Projections released that same year suggested the lake could fall to its lowest level in the history of the reservoir by 2027, breaking the previous record set in 2022 by a wide margin. The negotiations among the 7 states that share the river have not kept pace with the physical reality of the water itself. A new long-term management framework meant to replace expiring interim rules missed its original deadline, and while some states have proposed leaving more water in the system through the remainder of the decade, others have not agreed to the terms. Every short-term extension reached over the past 20 years has done essentially the same thing, buy time without closing the actual gap between what the river produces and what the original 1922 agreement promises on paper. Meanwhile, engineers continue trying to buy the system more room to maneuver. In 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation committed tens of millions of dollars to installing new turbines at Hoover Dam specifically designed to keep generating power even as the lake falls toward the minimum power pool threshold, something the dam's original 1930s-era turbines were never built to handle. It is, in its own way, a mirror of what Las Vegas did underground a decade earlier, an engineering fix aimed at surviving a falling lake, rather than a fix for why the lake keeps falling in the first place. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. The third intake beneath Lake Mead is a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering, one of the most difficult underwater tunneling projects ever completed, and it has bought Las Vegas a level of security that most cities dependent on a single shrinking water source simply do not have. But it does not add a single additional gallon to the Colorado River. It does not resolve the mismatch between a legal agreement signed over a century ago and a river that, thanks to a warming climate and a multi-decade megadrought, now produces significantly less water than that agreement assumes. Somewhere beneath the surface of Lake Mead, a $1.5 billion machine is quietly doing exactly what it was built to do. Whether that is enough or simply a very sophisticated way of postponing a much larger reckoning across the entire American Southwest is a question no tunnel, pump, or turbine can ultimately answer.